What if everything you've heard about immigration and wages is wrong? Mainstream media often insists that more immigration is always good for the economy. More workers, more growth, a free lunch with no downsides. But in this video we're turning that narrative on its head. We'll explore how slowing down low-skill immigration could mean bigger paychecks for the lowest-paid workers, a surge in automation and productivity, less strain on public services, even cooler housing prices, and environmental gains. This isn't just about the United States. The principles apply to any immigration-heavy country, Australia, Canada, the EU, you name it. Stick around till the end, because we'll reveal a surprising benefit that might shock you. Let's dive in. Does an influx of new workers drive down wages for natives, or is that a myth? Economists have debated this fiercely for decades. In one famous case, economist David Card examined the 1980 Mariel Boatlift, when 125,000 Cubans suddenly arrived in Miami, and concluded it had essentially no effect on wages of low-skilled Miami workers. This reassuring finding became the go-to citation for the immigration doesn't hurt wages camp. But hold on. In 2015, Harvard's George Borjas reanalyzed the same event, and found a very different result. Borjas argued that Card missed the impact on the most vulnerable workers. By focusing on native male high school dropouts, the group most directly in competition with the Cuban influx, Borjas found their wages dropped dramatically, by as much as 30% between 1979 and 1985 in Miami. In plain English, a flood of new low-skill labor did push local low-skill wages way down, exactly as basic supply and demand would predict. Not everyone agreed with Borjas' methods. Critics said his sample was tiny and results cherry-picked. But his findings lit a fire under the debate. The Borjas versus Card showdown showed that this isn't settled science, yet it raised a crucial point. There is evidence that a tighter labor supply can lift wages at the bottom. Historical trends paint a similar picture. Go back to the mid-20th century, meatpacking, a tough blue-collar industry, used to pay well above the average wage. In the 1960s and 1970s, a meatpacking worker earned about 15 to 20% more than the typical manufacturing worker. Back then, the workforce was heavily unionized and largely native-born. But in the 1980s, companies like IBP revolutionized the industry by busting unions, moving plants to rural areas, and hiring a cheaper, often immigrant workforce. The result? By 2002, meatpacking wages had plummeted to 24% below the manufacturing average. In just a couple decades, meatpackers went from a middle-class job to a bottom-rung job, as an influx of cheap labor helped companies drive wages way down. This dramatic shift is a cautionary tale. When employers have a ready supply of vulnerable, inexpensive workers, wages in those jobs can crater. Conversely, if that labor supply is curtailed, employers must compete for workers by offering better pay. We've even seen wage gains in real time when migrant labor was cut off. Example: the Bracero program brought seasonal Mexican farm workers to the U.S. for decades, until it ended in 1964. Many predicted disaster for U.S. agriculture without this low-wage workforce. Instead, something fascinating happened. Farm wages jumped sharply. In California, the United Farm Workers Union led by Cesar Chavez won a 40% wage increase in 1966, right after Bracero's end-raising grape picker pay from $1.25 to $1.75 an hour. With fewer cheap hands available, farm owners had to pay more to attract local workers. In short, cutting off the low-wage labor flow helped the poorest workers get a raise. Higher wages aren't the only consequence of tightening the labor supply. Faced with fewer cheap workers, companies often get creative. They invest in automation and productivity. After the Bracero program ended and wages rose, growers didn't simply give up. Many accelerated efforts to mechanize labor-intensive tasks in the fields. Cotton farms, for instance, rapidly adopted mechanical harvesters once cheap hand-picking labor was gone. Tomato growers introduced machines to harvest tomatoes, innovations that had been on the shelf for years, but weren't widely used while braceros were plentiful. This jump in mechanization meant higher productivity per worker, and ultimately made those industries less labor-dependent. Recent scholarship backs this up. Economists who studied the Bracero program's end concluded that ending the influx of cheap foreign labor did more to spur labor-saving automation than to draw in lots of new U.S. workers. In other words, farmers chose machines over trying to desperately recruit domestic workers at much higher wages. This isn't just ancient history or agriculture either. Modern evidence from advanced economies shows the same pattern. Abundant cheap labor can delay automation while labor scarcity catalyzes it. A 2024 study in the Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization examined immigration and robot adoption in Denmark, a high-tech country. The researchers found that in municipalities where more low-skilled immigrants arrived, local firms adopted significantly fewer mechanization. By now, it's clear that slower low-skill immigration is equal to tighter labor market at the bottom, which leads to higher wages and more investment in labor-saving technology. Both of those effects can contribute to higher productivity per worker. When companies can't just hire 4 $10 per hour workers to do a job, they might invest in one $30 per hour worker with a machine, and that worker-machine combo can produce far more output. Over time, this dynamic could lift overall productivity growth. In economic terms, scarce labor is a driver of efficiency. Some historians even argue that America's greatest productivity leaps came when labor was relatively scarce and expensive, forcing innovation, not during periods when labor was abundant and cheap. Importantly, rising wages at the bottom also reduce inequality and boost morale. Workers who feel fairly compensated are often more motivated and productive. And when the lowest paid workers see their incomes climb, it stimulates consumer demand, because these workers tend to spend extra earnings on goods and services. That increased demand can spur business growth and job creation in a virtuous cycle. In short, putting more money in the pockets of the working class isn't just good for them, it can be good for the whole economy's dynamism. Another often overlooked benefit of slower immigration is relief for public services and government budgets. Large-scale immigration, particularly of poorer workers, can strain schools, hospitals, and welfare systems in receiving countries. Taxpayers foot the bill for education, healthcare, infrastructure, and social programs to support a growing population. When that population grows very quickly via immigration, local governments can struggle to keep up. Class sizes swell, emergency rooms get crowded, and budgets get stretched. Studies have quantified this fiscal impact. The U.S. National Academy of Sciences Comprehensive Report, 2016, found that at the state and local level, immigrants on average cost more in services than they contribute in taxes, especially immigrants with lower education levels who earn low incomes. In fact, one analysis of the data found that the typical immigrant creates a net fiscal burden of about $16,000 per year on state and local governments, mainly due to public schooling for children, Medicaid, and other local services. Over millions of immigrants, that adds up to tens of billions in extra costs that native taxpayers cover. At the federal level, the picture is more mixed, because working immigrants do pay payroll and income taxes, but many also qualify for tax credits or other benefits. High-skilled immigrants tend to be net contributors, while low-skilled immigrants tend to be a net fiscal drain. Now imagine a scenario with a slower inflow of low-income immigrants. Public schools would have fewer new ESL students to accommodate each year, allowing more resources for the existing local student population. State and local governments could redirect funds from emergency healthcare or welfare for newly arrived poor families into other priorities, or even into tax cuts or debt reduction. Social services would face less pressure, potentially improving quality of service for residents. For example, if a city isn't growing as fast, its housing assistance and transit systems might finally catch up to demand instead of constantly falling behind. Policymakers could take the breathing room and budgetary savings to invest in productivity-enhancing areas like R&D, infrastructure, or higher education for the native workforce. These kinds of investments can raise long-run growth. Critics often respond that immigrants also grow the economy, so we need them to fund future entitlements, etc. It's true that more people means a bigger GDP in absolute terms, but what matters for fiscal balance is GDP per capita, and whether newcomers are net contributors or net users of public resources. If we selectively slow low-skill immigration, which is the group most likely to use public assistance or have lower tax contributions, the fiscal equation improves. Lower strain on social programs means, for instance, a state might afford to raise teacher salaries or expand a job training program for citizens. These kinds of quality improvements can boost productivity indirectly. If you live in a big city, you've probably felt the housing crunch sky-high rents, home prices that keep young families locked out of the market. There are many reasons, zoning laws, low interest rates, etc., but here's one you won't hear acknowledged often. Immigration is a significant driver of housing demand. When a region's population grows rapidly, housing construction often lags behind, and prices shoot up. Immigrants, like anyone else, need places to live. and most tend to settle in urban or suburban areas where jobs are. Economists have found a direct link between immigration inflows and higher housing costs. Harvard's Albert Saiz, in a widely cited study, showed that an immigrant inflow equal to 1% of a city's population raises that city's rents and housing values by about 1%. This might not sound huge, but consider that many U.S. cities grew 5 to 10% or more due to immigration over a decade. That would translate into roughly a 5 to 10% housing price increase, attributable just to immigrant-driven demand. Other studies have confirmed that immigration increases home prices on aggregate, with some estimates that the impact on housing prices is 3 to 10 times larger than the impact on native wages. In plain terms, immigrants affect housing costs more than they affect job markets. So what happens if we slow down the influx? House price growth would likely moderate, especially in high-demand metro areas. This is not speculative, we have examples. During 2020 to 2021, immigration to the U.S. slowed dramatically due to COVID restrictions. And guess what? Despite low interest rates, some of the fastest-growing housing markets cooled off. By 2022 to 2023, as immigration rebounded, demand pressure returned. In Australia, a country candid about the connection, experts noted that the pause in immigration during COVID gave a breather to the housing market, but the subsequent ramp-up of migration in 2023 was forecast to add significant upward pressure on rents and prices again. Fewer people coming in means fewer new households competing for apartments, which gives builders a chance to catch up and allows vacancies to rise a bit, taming price spikes. For young native-born families or longer-term immigrant families already here, that could mean a shot at buying a home at a reasonable price. Let's talk about social cohesion, the glue that holds a society together, shared trust values and community solidarity. This is a sensitive topic, but the research is illuminating. A huge meta-analysis published in 2020 examined 1,001 estimates from 87 studies across Western countries and found a clear pattern. Ethnic diversity is associated with lower social trust, especially at the local neighborhood level. Harvard political scientist Robert Putnam famously found that in highly diverse communities people tend to hunker down, they withdraw and trust neither their neighbors nor outsiders. Basically, everyone becomes a bit more isolated psychologically when there's less common ground. Why mention this in a video about immigration and wages? Because social cohesion has economic implications. High social trust societies tend to have stronger economic growth and better institutional quality. If slower immigration leads to slower pace of change and more time for integration, it could foster higher cohesion. Workers who trust each other and their employers can collaborate more effectively. Consumers who trust their neighbors are more likely to engage in local commerce and civic activities. And now for that surprise benefit we mentioned earlier. Environmental gains. Yes, immigration policy can even influence the fight against climate change and pollution. The US and other wealthy nations have large carbon footprints per person. When someone moves from a lower consumption country to a higher consumption country, their carbon emissions typically increase dramatically. A study by the Center for Immigration Studies quantified this. On average, immigrants to the US quadruple their carbon emissions. Altogether, US immigrants produce an estimated 637 million metric tons of CO2 annually, which is 482 million tons more than if they had remained in their home countries. That extra 482 million tons is like adding a new country. It would rank about 10th in the world for emissions. A slower pace of immigration could make achieving climate targets easier. It also means less sprawl, slowing the paving over of natural habitats for new subdivisions. Quality of life could improve with less traffic congestion and pollution in fast-growing metro areas. We've covered a lot. Higher wages for the working class, greater incentives for automation and productivity, fiscal and public service relief, improved housing affordability, stronger social cohesion, and environmental benefits. All potential upsides of a slower pace of immigration, especially of lower-skilled workers. These are perspectives you rarely hear in the media, which often portray any call for less immigration as foolish or xenophobic. But as we've shown, there are solid, data-backed reasons to believe that tighter control of labor inflows can boost a nation's prosperity and well-being. Does this mean immigration is bad and zero immigration would be ideal? No. Immigration brings entrepreneurship, new ideas, and cultural vibrancy. Skilled immigrants, in particular, can drive innovation. Think of all the tech founders who are immigrants. And humanitarian refugees deserve consideration beyond economics. The point is not to swing to the opposite extreme, but to challenge the simplistic notion that more immigration is automatically good for everyone. The reality is about balance. A country needs to calibrate immigration to its economic and social capacity. For decades, the US and some others have erred on the side of more filling low-wage jobs with an ever-growing supply of new workers. That made some employers and investors very happy, but it left many native and earlier immigrant workers with stagnant wages and precarious prospects. Think about it. In an era of rising inequality, climate urgency, and strained infrastructure, one policy tweak moderating immigration addresses a piece of each puzzle. It's not a cure-all, but it could make those goals easier to achieve. No free lunches, as economists like to say, but this might be close to it, foregoing some quantity of cheap labor in return for broad-based gains in quality of life. So the next time someone tells you that without endless immigration, our economy will collapse, remember what you learned here? It's a provocative idea, we know. This runs against the grain of a lot of punditry. But as we've shown, it's backed by evidence from history, economics, and our current moment. Maybe it's time policymakers give this idea the serious consideration it deserves. After all, shouldn't an economy serve its people? And if empowering workers, strengthening social bonds, and securing a sustainable future means being a bit more selective about the quantity and skill mix of immigrants, that's an option worth exploring. Thank you for watching and keeping an open mind. Sometimes doing what's best for workers and society means challenging orthodoxy. This is one of those times. Whether you're in the US, Australia, Canada, or anywhere grappling with these questions, the conversation about immigration's impact is crucial. Let's have that conversation based on facts, not fear, and now you have a lot more facts in hand.